Okay, I'm Massimo Dita. I'm a maritime archaeologist at the Stavanger Maritime Museum, and we're gonna go a little bit north, a little bit different material, a bit older as well, as I'm gonna talk about my experience with documenting archaeological nautical timbers. So instead of documenting whole boats, I'm gonna talk about documenting fragmentary nautical material. So when we think about Norway, especially Norway, the first thing comes to mind, obviously, are, at least when it comes to maritime heritage, are the Viking vessels. Since 2022, the Nordic clinker shipbuilding tradition has entered the intangible UNESCO list. And this tradition dates back at least to millennia. So in a sense, we are still talking about traditional boats, but for over 1,000 years ago. And there are not many finds in Norway of fully preserved Viking Age vessel beside the one found in grave mounds in eastern Norway. However, there are, in western Norway, there is over 300, more than 300 single unique ID finds from vessels from the period. Both material from the period can be distinguished into main categories. They are mostly coming from graves, and ships and boats in the Viking Age in Norway were such an important element. They entered the religious discourse and they are used as graves inside mounds. But there are also a series of finds coming again from land, from specifically wetlands, which we have a lot in Western Norway. So they are deposited in the ground as intentional deposition, as a ritual, as offerings, but as well as wreck remains, as there's been an uplift in Norwegian coast since the last ice age. As rife outs, so pre-work timber that were as part of the tradition of boat building, timber were cut, prepared, and deposited in wetlands for later use, and as well as part of equipment. So there are over 50 unique entries and over 300 unique timber remains in dozens of parts. And as part of my ongoing doctoral research project, I decided that it was time to look at all this material from Western Norway and document it according to nautical archaeological standards that's been developed for the past 25 years in Europe. And this is to answer some really specific questions. First of all, like to have an overview of this material. We have to think of this material I showed you briefly has been excavated and found in Norway 140, 100 years ago. So we are talking about legacy data. So there are deposits in Norwegian museums with Viking Age material, boat material found over 100 years ago. So you can imagine the quality of documentation at the time was not what we are used today, and the majority of these timbers, they've never been documented in any sort. So my plan was to, again, look at this material, understand it, contextualize it according to the historical context of the time, and at the same, understand societies through timbers, through their boats. So obviously, I need to document this material, and I decided to go for a method that I co-developed between 2016 and 2018, which we published in 2020. It is a legacy from a previous methodology developed in Denmark, where digitizing contact arms were used for documenting timbers in 3D. Timbers are extremely complicated object to work. If entire boats are complicated in itself, single timbers are also quite difficult to work with because there are several details from the material to constructional features, different elements. So we want to be able, as archaeologists, to extract and divide this information so we can read and understand every single timber. So during a large commercial project in the Baltic, when an infamous pipeline was built, we found several wrecks that need to be recovered and documented and preserved. So we had to develop quickly a method that was time efficient, precise enough, and follow archaeological standards. And then later on in 2018, the method was refined and for a specific excavation of a wreck, the Bismarck ship from 1188 in Germany. At the time I was working already for the Stavanger Maritime Museum, so I was in collaboration with the German state authority for this project. So we excavated this wreck, we documented every single stage of excavation and recovering of timbers in 3D, and then subsequently we recorded in 3D, we scanned with a structural light scanner every single timber in order to produce both a digital copy of every single timber, but at the same time use the digital timber as a basis for producing a notation or a catalog of 2D data, so we can be able to understand and interpret every single timber. So we use both 3D, a combination of 3D data and 2D data. This was an essential step for reconstructing even the vessel. The great advantage of using this method was that we were able to directly 3D print with laser sintering methods a copy of the wreck site. This is an essential step when we are working with the clinker construction, since the shape of the vessel is not given by the frames, by the ribs, like in carver construction, but is given by the skin of the vessel. So being able to print every single plank, which has a specific shape, allows us to recreate physically the object and its shape, something that cannot really be easily done yet digitally. Subsequently, obviously, the model is re-recorded digitally, and from there we can work for reconstruction, go into the reconstruction the vessel, and give an image of how the ship looked like. So this is basically the simple methodological approach. So the 3D annotated scan method has the advantage of being extremely accurate and detailed, which allows us to use the 3D model for interpretation and have an objective digital copy of the objects. It allows us to 3D print and use the 3D model directly in digital modeling and produce accurate 3D solids. We create automatically from this 3D model 2D timber catalog, so which is easier during research and even sharing the data for quickly go through all the nautical timber for understanding every single object, and is extremely time and cost efficient compared to previous documentation method. And the great advantage of this methodology, since it's been developed in, published in 2020, that we have a collaborative effort with several other European colleagues. So the method is constantly evolving, using different type of scanner and different standard according to projects. It cannot only be used for documenting single timbers, but even more intact objects, like this is a traditional what remains of a traditional boat excavated in Western Norway in fresh water, where it was documented with the same methodology and 3D annotated, so we can zoom in and look at every single detail. Identify, for example, repairs and different phases in the construction of the vessel, instead of just simply have a 3D model. From that, the phase developed in 2020, where obviously there's been changes in tools used, but the concept of the methodology remained the same. I went from the EVA to the Leo, which is a much better scanner for these purposes and still way cheaper compared to the previous method, which produces exactly what we need, 3D models with textures. There's also an extremely good tool for working with a really dark material. This is the status of most of the material I have documented. It's something that was excavated over 100 years ago, conserved with the really aggressive methods at the time. So it's really fragmentary, really eroded, really black and shiny. And most of the time working in a repository, I do not have access to much space, so I need something fast and portable. This is an example. You can see it's really extremely shiny type of timber because it's been treated with a combination of PEG and glues back in the 50s. But nevertheless, I was able to extract every single detail, such as tool marks and morphology. These are some examples. The method really gives the opportunity to go into the construction process of every single timber, from the fashioning from the original tree to details in decorations and molds. The other advantage of this method, what is using the LEO, is that you can combine photogrammetry as well, so you can extract high quality texture from photos, overlapping the accuracy 3D geometry from the scanner with the high texture quality of photogrammetry. I think this should start. Yeah, so basically this is one of the output, like the simple 2D output is a catalog with the view of the leaf timbers and their section. We accompany with an important description of every single timber, highlighting the construction features, which is essential because just the 2D model itself will not be enough to understanding these objects, so you need interpretations as well. Some of the study cases, just briefly showing what we can go from the 3D data, what it can be used for. This is a really interesting boat. Doesn't look as much, but is one of the oldest Viking Age boat ever found in Scandinavia. It's the Olmeda boat. It was excavated like in 1926. So even though there is a nice side plans, the boat afterward was briefly published in an obscure museum publication in Norwegian. Everybody forgot about this vessel and has been laying in those shelves, forgotten. But thanks to documenting every single object, every single element in 3D, I was able to reconstruct, bring back the vessel. So a starting point for analysis and understanding how both the construction, how it was used, and the importance, since this was placed in a grave. It was a woman grave. So this boat definitely had an importance for the societies at the time. Another use is to going back to legacy data. This in 1921 in Western Norway, there were found 2 boats in a wetland. There were offerings. They were ritually destroyed and placed in a bog, and then excavated. And recently, they've been dated to 800 AD, so we are in the early Viking Age as well. And even though they were ritually destroyed and lots of the material got lost in the time, they've been reconstructed already in 1926 and always presented as monumental truth. The reality is a bit different. When you now had the chance to go back to the material, I was able to compare what the works done in 1926, where no metadata or paradata were available. You just need to trust what the archaeologists were saying at the time. Now it's possible to compare and see that there might be differences, so the ships and the boat might have looked slightly different. So this is also the great advantage of the data. You can compare with previous work and leave metadata and paradata imprint with your work. So these are some examples. You can see there are differences in what has been reconstructed and what actually the archaeological material showed. So there is definitely plenty of room for interpretation there. Another case regarding how we can use this data, it's the oldest ship in a grave found in Scandinavia. It's again from Western Norway, built in 770 AD, and it was probably a local king that was buried in his beautiful ship. Unfortunately, that's what happened. It was excavated quite early in the late 1888. So again, the archaeological documentation standards were not the same that we will use today. So we had to rely a lot on what has been published briefly and going through fieldwork notebooks. Not much was left of the ship, and it's been debated for years that this perhaps was a sailing vessel, this was a roving vessel, but never, no answer ever came up regarding that. The main issue is also that the 2D documentation or the classical documentation that was done on the boats during the year changes a lot. These are like 4 drawings of the same part that are completely different from each other. But because of 3D documentation, we are able to reassemble, in a way, these parts and use that as a basis for analysis. Obviously, we cannot reconstruct the whole ship based on that, but by archaeologically analyzing this element, we can give some interesting insight on technology, and all elements points at the moment that this perhaps it is the earliest sailing vessel in Scandinavia. yeah, so it's possible to even highlight tool marks for and be able to reconstruct the type of tool used behind it. And even try to visualize how, since there is no official site plan for this site, no photograph ever taken, but we have only accounts from the archaeologists at the time, we can even try to visualize how the ship might have been placed inside the grave mound. So yeah, basically I wanted to just show you that 3D documentation can be used not only for documenting whole boats, but also to focus on fragmentary elements, which are really important for extracting information regarding construction and society as well. Obviously, there are limitations like any other methods, but that's why we are here, both creating standards and sharing idea. So, thank you very much.